So, welcome everyone to the Torrey Botanical Society's Torrey Lecture Series. This is welcome to our April Torrey Talk. I'm Catherine Mercier. I am the Society Programming Chair. Before we get started, I'd love to give you a little information about the Society. So we are the oldest botanical society in the Americas, and we're founded in 1867 and are an organization for anyone interested in plant life, from amateur and professional botanists, students, and people who simply enjoy nature. The objectives of the society are to promote an interest in botany, to collect and disseminate information on all phases of plant science. And to achieve those objectives, we have a lot of different sort of facets of what we do. One of them is the public lectures like this. We also have field trips. I'm going to highlight some upcoming field trips at the end of the month in just a minute. We also have the Journal of the Torrey Botanical Society. We have undergraduate and graduate student research grants, and also support symposia and regional conferences. To stay up to date for everything that the Society is doing, you can become a member, which you can find out more about on our website, torreybotanical.org, or by following us on social media. Our handle almost everywhere is at Torrey Botanical, and on YouTube, we are at Torrey Botanical Society. Sorry, my eyes are itchy. Yes, so this, at the end of the month, is the City Nature Challenge, and we have 3 field trips that weekend. So on Saturday, April 27th, we're going to have a field trip in Staten Island at Ocean Breeze Park, and then on Sunday the 28th at Calvert Bow Park in Brooklyn. And these are both going to be led by our field chair, Zihao. And then Lydia will be leading a walk in the Bronx at Riverdale Park on Monday afternoon. Sorry, I need to rub my eyes for a second. I'm crying. I'm just so excited about the City Nature Challenge walks. So please join us for one or more of the walks the last weekend of April. And before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to give a few notes about Zoom. So feel free to, during the talk, have your camera on or off, but please do keep yourself muted. You're welcome to put comments and questions in the chat during the lecture, but those will be addressed at the end of the talk. If you put questions in the chat, I will read them out. Or at the end of the talk, you can use the raise hand feature to raise your hand and then unmute and ask your question. And Zoom has a maybe cool new feature that if you literally like raise your hand on camera, it's supposed to recognize that as like a raise hand button. So if anyone wants to try that, we can test it. And then I will stop sharing and introduce our speaker. So I'm very excited about our talk today. It's like almost a year in the making. I talked to Ashley initially at the Botany Conference last year in Boise about potentially talking about art and science for the society. And it's here and it's happening, which is exciting. So Ashley is a PhD student at the University of Florida, where she studies fossilized plants. She primarily works with Eocene-Miocene angiosperm fruits and seeds, with an emphasis on micro-CT scanning as a medium of non-destructive study. She's interested in using personal artistic experience in scientific research and outreach. In her art, she seeks to understand and incorporate the places she lives and plants that she interacts with. Her work overall is based on a firm belief that deepening our relationship with plants can enrich our lives and futures and connect us to hope in a world suffering from climate change. And I will just vamp while she gets screen share set up about, I don't know. Oh, I didn't forget to say one thing. So if you would like to share this talk with someone or rewatch it in the future, it will be recorded and posted on our YouTube page, where you can watch many of our past talks, which again is at Torrey Botanical Society on YouTube. And now I will hand it over to Ashley to talk to us about creativity at the forefront of understanding art, science, and ourselves as entangled necessities in a world in transition.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, cool. All right. So I think I've screen shared it properly. Yeah, I would like to talk a little bit about art and science and the little baby steps I've been taking into that as a mostly geologist and botanist. Can I, oh no, there we go. Okay. So I was introduced a little bit, but my name is Ashley Hamersma. My pronouns are she, her. I did an undergrad at the University of Michigan in Earth and Environmental Science, so geology. And then I'm a PhD student currently at University of Florida, working with novel non-destructive methods. So like CT scanning, that's basically an X-ray for plants, so for rocks. Reconstruction with computer programs to make those X-rays into nice models. And really good microscopy and also morphometrics, so being able to tell things apart based on what they look like and how they're shaped. That picture below my face is a plate from one of the papers I recently published on Bellinocarpa tertiaria, so a new genus of Euphorbiaceae from the past. I'm also interested in combining science and art to better introduce and sustain interest in scientific topics in both university students and general public audiences. And with that, I am dedicated to inclusive and accessible scientific pedagogy, being a disabled educator and student myself. So I'm from Grand Rapids, Michigan. So that's why my plant in the chat was hepatica, which definitely doesn't grow down here in Florida. But I grew up surrounded by plants and with heavy experience in the natural world from a really young age. So shout out to my parents and my educators for that. I worked in paleobotany at the laboratory of Dr. Selena Smith at U of M. That was my introduction to fossilized plants, and I absolutely fell in love with them and ended up coming down here to Florida to do a PhD. Dissertation research is kind of a smaller subset of the things I'm interested in, which combines fruit and seed ID and outreach teaching projects, and also evaluates the effectiveness of those educational projects so that we can do good education. This is a fun reconstruction of Bellinocarpa tertiaria, so that plant you saw on the prior slide, that just shows how CT work, micro CT tomography, can really bring to life plants that otherwise you really would have to cut through hundreds of times to get the slices to make this sort of reconstruction, and upon which you would destroy the fossil. So the orange here is kind of the outer part of the fruit, and then the colors, the pink, blue, and green, are those internal casts of the seeds that would have been inside it. So a lot of people, when I first say that I'm a scientist and an artist, they look at me and they say, I thought scientist was the opposite of artist, like one deals with truth and one deals with beauty. But I don't know where exactly that misconception came from. It's a pervasive line of thought, and it definitely ruled the first 2 decades of my life. So I came to science extremely willingly, but with some regret, trepidation, distress, because for some reason I felt like once I signed that paperwork that said I was doing a geology degree, I would never be able to do art professionally or even as a part of the thing I'm supposed to be passionate about. And for way too long, I stopped doodling during class. I tried to be the perfect scientist or whatever estimation of that existed in my head. And art had a way of getting into everything I did anyways. I figured out pretty early in grad school that I'm neurodivergent, I have ADHD, and suddenly a lot of the things I did during class in college made sense, like draw to try to focus on things. I realized I'd actually gotten really, really good at doodling highly accurate plants when I was trying to focus. And at some point, my advisor in grad school, Dr. Manchester, saw these plants, and I began drawing reconstructions for people in my lab. Let's go to the next slide here, like these two. So these are from published papers that my lab mates submitted last year. And reconstructions, while they're not usually considered paleo art, they do require me to use creativity and unique perspectives as a botanist to bring these plants to life. So understanding how leaves attach, how fruits attach, but also that some of these things may have changed throughout time, and the plants that these are related to may not necessarily look exactly like the ancient plants. So I do get to use some creativity in my reconstructions. And while I love doing reconstructions, I've started thinking of more outside the box ways of communicating paleobotany to a broader audience in the past. And I also want to highlight that there's a huge amount of evidence behind scientists not being the opposite of artist. Root Bernstein has done a ton of work showing that polymathy is really common among successful scientists. Kagan 2015 is a really good landmark paper on how artistic research and climate science can work together to provide multidisciplinary and transdisciplinary learning, and then spaces of possibilities for the future. And on and on. I only referenced 3 here because I ran out of space, and you're told not to put really small writing on slides. But if you look this up, you can definitely find hundreds of articles on how science and art are conflated in a lot of disciplines. So before I talk a little bit about paleo art, I want to define some things because I know not everybody's familiar with paleo art, and I don't know if I would have come up with these exact definitions before I did research for this talk. But paleo art, as defined by Mark Hallett in 1987, stresses the importance of the cooperative effort between artists, paleontologists, and other specialists, so everybody who creates the data and the drawings, in gaining access to information for generating accurate, realistic restorations of extinct animals and their environments. Notice here that they don't say extinct plants in their environments. Plants are just kind of in the environment part of that. We'll talk about that at length, I promise. Many definitions of paleo art also necessitate subjectivity based on artist style. So while things are accurate, they may be drawn slightly differently. Paleo imagery or paleontologically inspired art is a slightly different concept, and it falls into a broader category of paleontology influenced imagery. So, for instance, cultural and media depictions of prehistoric life, which don't necessarily include scientific accuracy as a goal. And as I said before, some definitions do include reconstructions in paleo art, but because of the stylistic and subjectivity choices that are often absent from a lot of reconstructions, that can be variable. Next slide. So when we think paleo art, what do we think? While I was saying those words, you probably had some images come to mind, maybe of open-mouthed angry dinosaurs, because not too long ago, I probably would have thought the same thing. Paleo art to me said lots of dinosaurs doing dinosaur things. And maybe if you don't work with plants every day, they're easier to miss in things like this, but identifiable plants in all of those images, all the imagery that comes to mind, are conspicuously absent. And accurately portrayed plants are a lot harder to find. You can see the middle image here is the only one that actually has any greenery plants in it, and they're definitely unidentifiable. They're way there in the back, like somebody just kind of stippled them on with a sponge. So they're plants, but they're not very identifiable. Just to hammer that home, plants make up, a significant and massively primary part of the biosphere, which everyone here probably knows. We interact with them or their derivatives every day. They have and still do make most life on Earth possible. Everybody's here because they love plants, which is why it's really interesting that out of these 6,769 words in the main article on Wikipedia about paleo art, plants are mentioned. I will let everybody get an idea in their head of what they want to guess for this number. And then I will move on. Twice. Plants are mentioned twice. Neither of them are references to specific extinct plants. They're references to like flora, and I think one of the words was stem. For reference, the word dinosaur, and not to mention all the dinosaurs mentioned by name and synapsids and other groups of extinct animals, it's written 93 times. I find it particularly frustrating that there's quite a bit of reference to landscapes, environments, backgrounds, habitats, and other supporting characters when these are primarily made up of plants. And when they're not, they're often depicted as flat, rocky plateaus or barren sands, which are, as are often pointed out in like Reddit threads and YouTube comments, are often inaccurate reconstructions of dinosaur habitats. And I will say that some people, especially scientists, might bristle at my use of Wikipedia here as a primary source, but it's for an important point because if people are going to Google the term paleo art, this is one of the top resources they're going to come into contact with, and that's whether scientists like it or not. This is one of the most likely interfaces between people who want to learn about paleoart and people like me, paleobotanists. And if we're not even represented here in the world's free encyclopedia, our reach is going to be drastically reduced already, and that is a problem. So my overall point is being, if you want the general public to care about science, they have to know we exist as scientists, and for that we have to bring the resources to a general public audience. I feel like that kind of contributes to getting illustrations like this, which at first glance, it looks great. Look at all that foliage. A lot of it is identifiable. I see a taxodium back there, so the like swamp cypress that you're familiar with if you're from the south. I see an araucaria back here. I'll let that slide, though I'm not sure that that would be in this area, but also these dinosaurs shouldn't be living at the same time, so we'll let it slide. But this, oh, do we not? Did we not go forward? There. This plant, though, I have a little bit of a problem with this being included. It is Heliconia, and this happens to be a plant I know a lot about, having done my undergraduate research on the family. It's a late Eocene plant by a molecular clock estimate, and this is decidedly not a late Eocene reconstruction. So even though there are plants here, it's not necessarily correct. There's a nice cycad in front of it, but Heliconia should not be in here. So that's the little modern Heliconia there. I think it looks a lot like it. Here's a depiction by Mark Whitten. So that's a paleo artist I really admire, actually, for bringing prehistoric animals to life in uncommon looks and behaviors. And one problem with this, even though I love this illustration, is this looks like grass, and there's something that looks kind of like a flower in the background, which neither of which existed at this time. Angiosperms really did not exist. Witten's style is pretty dreamy, so I'll give him the benefit of the doubt here and say that that's some really lively moss. Nice cycads down in the front. Those are solidly Permian, so good choice there. And if I seem really picky about this, and I am being really picky, I would like to point out that I found this illustration in an online thread of inaccurate paleo art, but it wasn't because of the plants. It was because of the lips of the depicted therapsid, so the animal depicted here. There's some argument over whether the therapsids would have extending teeth over the lips or if the lips would cover the teeth. To complicate this even more, Whitten knows that, and he's drawn the animal this way just to hit back at the exposed teeth, angry reptile depictions of prehistoric fauna that we find everywhere. So my point being is that paleobotanic paleo art doesn't even have these types of arguments. Artists seem happy to just stick a plant anywhere as long as it's green. So there's a few different issues we're dealing with when it comes to artists depicting plant life. We, of course, have the complete lack of plants, as seen here, and then the aforementioned inaccuracies, which is a bit more pernicious. This might be a good time to point out that this also does happen with dinosaurs, right? Most animals depicted in Jurassic Park were actually Cretaceous, but it's been called out a lot more, at least in the circles I'm in. People are calling that out all the time. So we've got those complete disregard of plants, inaccurate depictions of plants, and the fact that both of these are non-interactive, and that's how most paleobotanic artistic media goes. It's illustrations, reconstructed scenes, things you walk past in a museum on your way to the dinosaur exhibit, where you're like setting up, this is the environment, this is the scene that dinosaurs would have been evolving and eating and running around in. It's background. You don't get the level of interaction that a lot of dinosaur media gets. Oh, I would like to point out that this depiction of Utahraptor is itself inaccurate. These dinosaurs have now been reconstructed in more feathery form, so before anybody comes for me on that. But this is what was correct based on what was known at the time when this was drawn. So I'm still using this as a depiction of very poor plant life, but I know the dinosaurs are incorrect. When we first see this, dinosaurs, vertebrates getting all the attention, I think the first impulse for a lot of us paleobotanists is to try to redirect the energy while still including dinosaurs as a central part of the narrative. And Mark Whitten, that paleobotanist or paleontologist from a couple of the reconstructions earlier, has spelled this out pretty well in a 2016 blog post that I have shared in lots of classes that I've taught. He says, one of the commonest strategies used frequently for semi-technical books on fossil animals is to make sure dinosaurs remain prominently mentioned even in those events or products which are focused on completely unrelated groups of animals. And this is the kicker for me. We just don't trust most non-dinosaur clades to draw crowds or revenue on their own, and we have to spin them as being relevant to dinosaurs in some way. A great example of this is the only paleobotanist in popular culture, as far as I know, feel free to correct me, Dr. Ellie Sattler. I can confirm that I am very regularly asked, oh, like Ellie Sattler? When I introduce myself to my first year bio classes or new students or to literally anyone on earth. And I have taken to dressing like her on the first day of some of my classes just to get students to laugh and be engaged. But yes, like her, but also she studies dinosaur excrement. She studies coprolites and like the plants that the dinosaurs were eating. So again, she's dinosaur adjacent. For that reason, she's included in one of the most popular movies about dinosaurs of all time, popular movies of paleontology of all time. While she's an icon, I grew up loving her, and I also think her style is immaculate. I would also like some diversity of representation because the stuff I study looks a lot more like if when you open your spice cabinet than the things that she would be looking at. So what is going on? Why dinosaurs? Why is everybody attracted to dinosaurs as the poster child of ancient life? And given that I can look out my window and see literally hundreds of plants and zero dinosaurs, hopefully, unless Jurassic Park has become real, and usually zero animals, why do we find them so much more prevalent? And I think it's just the idea that giant lizards roaming the earth, it's very romantic. It's presented as a very romantic and whimsical idea to very young children. And then on through our lives is reinforced by museum exhibits, constant imagery, toys, movies, paleontological hype men at outreach events, BBC specials. I will say I did like the most recent BBC special, and probably everyone should watch it. It does have some plants in it. There are some tree ferns and some cycads and conifers. Video games get produced. So all sorts of dinosaur stuff all the time. Just to say that dinosaurs are introduced to people throughout their lives in myriad media at varying levels of complexity, which just boils down to they've had a really, really, really good PR team. What I want you to notice about some of these representations, a lot of them, is that they're interactive. So puzzles where you fit bones together, books that anthropomorphize dinos, activities that get students doing speculative reconstruction. So giving them like bones or pictures of skin fragments and saying like, what might this have looked like? This is really engaging, and it's getting students to really interact with the material instead of just relying on passive consumption, which a lot of paleobotanical education relies on. The more you look at exhibits in museums, the more you realize that plants are just there, unfortunately. So what is a paleobotanist to do about this? I would also like to share that there is some very, very good paleobotanical illustration reconstructions. This is, I believe, by Jan Friesen. It is a carboniferous swamp with some nice tree ferns and lepidodendron, so we can, take a little breather here after seeing all the dinosaurs and enjoy these old plants. Ah, nice swamp. So first, I set out to understand what am I up against here if I'm trying to teach people about plants, specifically fossilized plants. Do people just not know plants existed back then? Do they not know that there were all these wild different forms of them, like depicted in this picture here? Do they just not care? Do they not know enough? Do they not know why plants are important? And it turns out those are really great questions to be asking because very smart botanists and educators before me have come up with a way of defining those frustrations. They call it plant awareness disparity, which has formerly been known as plant blindness. That might be the term you've heard more often, but efforts are being made to move away from that so as not to portray disabilities as something that's inherently negative or requiring fixing. So I will use plant awareness disparity when I'm talking about it. There are 4 components of plant awareness disparity as defined generally. So attitude, not liking plants or being ambivalent about plants. Attention, not noticing plants. So people who walk down the street and don't realize that there are plants. Knowledge, not understanding the importance of plants, not understanding the diversity of plants. not having been taught about plants, and then relative interest. So we can only hold our attention to so many things at a time, and sometimes animals just are more interesting than plants. I will say that the knowledge deficit only model is largely unsupported, which can be difficult because that is often the way that we will teach. It's the model where we try to just increase knowledge about plants and the importance of them, where we're hoping that those other factors, if they're present, will just resolve themselves once people know more. So they will be attentive and they will be excited about plants and they'll be interested in plants as long as they have more knowledge. Unfortunately, that has been largely unsupported. Similarly, unfortunately, that tends to be the way that we teach, tends to be the model educators rely on, especially when talking to broad audiences. It's often how we're most comfortable teaching. We're not answering unexpected questions. We're not having students drop things. We're just lecturing. Um, However, that while I admire our enthusiasm for that and that everyone may pick up on our passion, that's not the way it works. So the knowledge only model is not something I'm going to be talking about. So with those components of plant awareness disparity identified, my question then becomes, how can we design effective botanical outreach to target them? How can I personally, I asked myself, combine my passion for fossil plants, my experiences in art, and the understanding of other successes in education to target particularly paleobotanical education and botanical education? So I reviewed a whole lot of literature for this part, as well as ran small, short classes with University of Florida-based programs like Wilmot Botanical Gardens, and thought back to my beginnings in all of this. So what had gotten me excited, what had spurred me to become a participant, not just a fan of plants. And that might be the point some of you are at, where you're interested in plants, you're interested in nature, but you're not sure or not ready to get into it in a more participatory way. And I realized that the main thing that taught me that I could combine plants and art in my passion, in my degree, is a class that my undergraduate advisor taught, where she had us do a paleobotanical art project at the end of the year. I still have the stamp I made of a fossilized fern stem, and I still stamp it on stuff. And it has been 6 years now. So that has been an enduring memory of that paleobotany class. It's the strongest memory I have of it. And with that, I realized that I probably should be putting art and science together so that I can get the most out of the things that I know. We don't want to be teaching ineffectively. It's not good for our ultimate goals. So I don't want to be using things like the knowledge only model. It's frustrating as well. It's just not a whole lot of fun. I've taught a lot of classes where I just talk at people, like intro bio classes, and those are the least memorable, the least engaged, the least exciting classes I teach for everybody. I promise, not just me. In contrast, when I'm able to incorporate creative work like natural dyeing, drawing, basket making, etc., I can keep students engaged and interested. And in evaluations, while still learning the concepts, I routinely get these classes or units as favored parts of the semester. So from students who do well in the class and they're understanding things, these are their favorite part of the semester, and they think they have learned the most from that. So something I've recognized from these experiences is that it's probably useful to focus on events or activities that already incorporate plants, create audience identities with plants, spark creative interest, and then also require audience participation. So that will get people involved, so they're actually doing things, not just passively staring at a textbook or reconstruction. They're using their creativity, so using both the left and right, I know it's not supported anymore, but different sides of their brain. We're creating an audience identity, so something that they can think back to and remember. And then things that already incorporate plants are often easier to get people interested in because they have an interest in it already. So some of the projects that I've been wanting to run and have run in some cases that can combine those things I've listed here. So something like ancient phenology, where each table in a classroom grows a different geologic era of plants, so their nearest living relatives. So for instance, maybe horsetails and lycopods at one table, and then the dawn of angiosperms, they've got magnolias and things like that at the next. Um, Ancient plant dinner is something I really would like to do, where you can only make dishes from plants that were around, 60 million years ago, or 80 million years, or 160 million years, which might be pretty gross because that was before flowering plants. That was before flowering plants arose. So you'd have a lot of like maybe pine nuts or ferns. Wouldn't be super tasty, but that would definitely teach people how different the environments were in the past. There's always match the ancient pollinator to the ancient plant. I've done some activities in school that were match the extant pollinator to the extant plant. Cretaceous, Oligocene, or Eocene flower shops. You could perhaps pair this with some sort of holiday like Mother's Day, where you say, let's design arrangements and bouquets based on only what would have grown during these times. And all of these activities would lead to the same objectives of understanding more about fossil plant diversity and evolution, as well as, in some cases, local environmental awareness. So that attention to plants and connection to place. Some of these you could involve chemistry in, history, ecology. You really could think of a combination for almost anything. I have found this a pretty fertile ground to be thinking in, and it makes me wonder if maybe fossil plants just really haven't been explored as a topic for lower, like younger educational outreach, rather than that there's nothing there. Um, So the main takeaway from that I've found is that all of us as botanists, plant lovers, plant scientists need to be really intentional about how we're communicating about plants to people, because connecting people with those plants fosters responsibility, relationality, and community just outside just human and animal actors. In addition, as I've seen, if you don't have business in your own representation, others will take it upon themselves to represent you however they want, and you'll end up with all sorts of angiosperms back in the Permian. So inaccurate representations. This is another paleo reconstructed climate or environment by Jan Vriesen. So it's a lot of dunes with a little oasis. It's part of it. So at the bottom here, there's some tracks, but that is the only trace of animals in this paleo art. So a little bit of a different idea. Oh, okay. One collaboration that I'm putting together is this idea of climbing through time. I'm working with my lab mate Inda Hoigle and her brother Colin Hoigle. So we are using, sorry, I'm trying to move this little thing around. We are using CT scans taken at the University of Florida to print and reconstruct climbing holds made out of paleontological materials. So this top left picture here is a bison tooth that we've made into something that you could screw onto a wall to climb on. There's a seed from Nyssa, it's a tupelo. There's a seed from Vitis, so an ancient seed from fossil grape, the grape genus. And then the print on the bottom is one that we actually made. So we're still in the production and planning stages of this experiment, just because the resin costs a lot of money and it takes a long time to print these. But this is something we're super excited about as a teaching experiment. The idea of this is that you'd be able to climb through time and tell a story based on a climbing wall or a physical installation in a museum. So in children's museums, local museums, parks, or even climbing gyms. Being able to base that on local paleontology or local botany, so pollen and spores or bits of like tooth, like that bison tooth. Two examples would be climbing through time in the Perth Basin or Canning Basin, which is somewhere I have worked, where you have long cores of lake sediments that you can take different taxa out of and reconstruct them. So you could climb up through the amount of time that that sediment has accrued over. You could do Florida's fossil flora and fauna based on the fossils from Montbrook, which is a vertebrate locality in Central Florida, and Alum Bluff, which is a plant locality up in the Panhandle to educate people on local fossils. Let's see. And the pedagogy of this is well supported. So the goal of this is to expose your audience to paleobotanical concepts or botanical concepts, deep time, local paleontology, local botany, using novel and memorable physical activity. So making something that is new to them and both fairly memorable. There's a lot of support for increased concept recognition when material is paired with play. There's particularly a lot of support for this with language acquisition. So if students recognize words and recognize concepts, they can be cemented much more strongly if physical activity is used along with the educational component. Physical activity is also linked to better academic outcomes, as well as physical and mental health, which are all important components of successful learning. And that's not just physical activity students get outside the classroom. That's when students have small breaks during class or are pairing physical interactions and activity with the things that they're learning. Another example of a project that I've recently run was this one. Backyard taphonomy is what I'm calling it. That's a bit of a mouthful. So if anyone has a better name for it, let me know. This involved working with students of a horticultural therapy group on UF campus. So I provided plant presses and we discussed how we notice plants in our environments and the mindfulness that is required for that to sit calmly or walk calmly and understand and notice plants around you, how the different plants need differing care in the plant press to survive. So that's related to taphonomy. So how different things survive the fossilization process. I've also linked that in different projects using, what is it called? Using natural dyeing with iron and tannin to make leaf impressions on different pieces of fabric, the taphonomy of that. Because I got to stretch this out over 2 weeks, I was able to do a skill share at the beginning and then give participants homework. So they took their plant press home and then they completed a task with that homework. So they put plants in the plant press. They brought it next time we met. And after that 2 weeks, so it was the 2 weeks between the classes, those plants dried out and we were able to use them to create something that was memorable. So this kept them thinking about the project. It required them to experiment in how they pressed the plants, so they weren't always going to work. Sometimes they were too wet or too thick, so they had to put extra cardboard and extra newspaper. So it required some creativity, and it required them to pay close attention to their surroundings. So if you're looking for pretty flowers in your surroundings or cool-shaped leaves, you're going to take notice that there are a lot of different types of plants. And believe it or not, that is often the first thing that students recognize is, oh, wow, plants have a lot of different forms. So getting them to do that bare minimum, low, like just looking at different forms of plants informed a lot about keeping their attention on plants throughout those 2 weeks. And in the end, they had an art project that reflected their surroundings. So they were able to take these dried plants out and glue them down on a piece of paper in different orientations, which is kind of almost like a compression fossil slab. That was not on accident. I did teach also about types of fossils. Um, and they got to keep the plant press for further experimentation. So they got something very useful out of the class. I got emails months later from participants in the class telling me how much they enjoyed it and that they were still using their plant presses and sending me more pictures of art they've made. And that was wonderful. That was one of the best responses I've gotten to something like this. I think I'm going to run that again this year. So another one of the projects that I'm doing kind of in the earlier stages involves natural dyes made from nearest living relatives of extinct plants from certain time periods or places. So this type of project could be taken in a lot of directions. Feel free to take this idea and run with it. You could create pigments from these taxa for watercolor. You could use color palettes to design fashion or costumes, somehow related to the time period and locality that the plants are from. You could even explore the chemistry of the dyes and pigments while also still learning about fossil plants. So on the bottom here, we've got a carboniferous dye palette where also club mosses can be used as an alum mordant. So that's an interesting use. And you could ask students questions like, can we even talk about this in such general terms? Like, what molecules are responsible for these colors, and would those molecules have even evolved yet? What purpose do they serve in the plants? Which some of them we don't even know, so that would open interesting discussions. So I kind of think, if I dare, that we are going into another botanical art renaissance here, considering there has been a whole lot of interest in botanical, not just illustration, but using plants in different projects. These are just the ones that I am a small part of, because I'm a very busy grad student and I cannot do everything. But there have been a couple issues of the Plant Science Bulletin that are specifically relating to art in the botanical sciences. There are going to be art and science-based symposia at IBC, and then they were also at Botany these last 2 years. And those are just the ones that I know of off the top of my head and that I'm involved in. There are a lot of things out there. And if you read the PSB, there's a ton of articles on how people have been incorporating art into their botany and how that's impacted their educational experiences and their science. So as I'm getting close to the end here, I want to reiterate that plants are important. I mean, everybody here knows that because you're interested in plants and you are listening to this talk. I also want to say the reason that I am so interested in paleobotany and paleoclimatology using art is because there are implications for climate predictions. And we're in kind of a pickle here on Earth with the way that our climate and sustainability has been progressing. Modern vegetation is based on past vegetation in some way. Modern vegetation is incredibly important to climate, soil acidity, ocean acidity, weather, greenhouse effect. And you can't plan for what you don't know is going to happen. You cannot stop something when you don't know how it happened. And you can't mitigate your worst outcomes without knowing what those might be. Left off the end of that, just too scared, you can put it down. Yeah, you can't mitigate your worst outcomes without knowing what those might be. So paleobotany is incredibly important to sustainable climate futures, and botany is as well. And I do believe that by using our combined passions of science and art, artists can have a large role in educating people on that. So these are some of the citations I included in this talk. Feel free to, I guess this is going to be on YouTube, so you could probably pause it there. But so I will open it up for questions at this time. If you have questions later or collaboration ideas, or you just want to hear more, I'm always happy to talk. I've got my school email there and also my personal email. For any sort of art collaborations, I would probably request you use my personal email, and we can chat about that. But yeah, thank you so much for listening, and I will take questions.
Thank you so much. That was
Of course.
amazing. I think all of your like workshop ideas and workshops that you've done are so cool. And while people are maybe getting their thoughts together for questions and raising their hand, I'd love to ask like, okay, so I love all these ideas. And you did mention like the groups that you've worked with, like at the Botanic Garden or through UF, but do you have any advice about sort of like finding the people to teach or like finding the groups to work with to run these?
Yes, cold email people.
Right.
I am not kidding. Like I gave like a smaller version of this talk at a conference I was recently at, and I had 8 people come up to me afterwards and want to do something to this effect. I did not know there was that much interest, even in my small little scientific world, about doing this stuff. Otherwise, I would recommend talking to directors and organizers of local museums, often especially museums that are early in their like museum career. So museums that have just been created are often interested in looking for exhibits. University museums are often fairly interested in running programs on art. Um, Local artist collectives in towns are often interested in that too. And I know a lot of places aren't fortunate enough to have places like that, but you could always start one as well. Um, I think a lot of people and organizations are interested in getting more outreach done. So places like, what is the southeastern chapter of BSA, I think, has done like a minor art thing. And then I'm probably
Mhm.
going to email the Florida Natural History or Natural Environment FNA. I get a magazine from them, the Palmetto, and it's always like, we're looking for ideas. And it's like, I have so many of those. Please take them. So, yeah, anything that you can think of that you think would might benefit from an outreach component. If you frame it like that, I think people are often very likely to desire that.
Very
Does that
cool.
answer your question?
Yes. Yeah, 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 totally. Thank you. Uh, all right. Feel free to just unmute or throw a question in the chat.
I'll open the chat. I also know that's a heck of a lot to digest. So if you have questions later, I've got my email there and feel free. Although I do have quals until May 3, so I will not answer you before that because
Fair, fair.
you won't get coherent answers.
I don't know if you
I'm
have
glad
the chat open. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Lydia says, I feel very inspired to think of ways to incorporate more hands-on stuff into my botany classes. That makes me so happy to hear. Kay says, really terrific lecture. How to spark interest in the grandchildren in botany is always a concern. Yeah, with younger people, often I'll find myself like just doing something off on my own. Like I do a lot of fiber and textile processing with plants. So I like make like baskets and cedar weavings and things. And kids really like things that they can use their hands to do. And I will say, little hands don't have a great time with baskets, but if they can make it stay in a circle, they are so happy. Like they're like, I made a basket. It's great. Yeah, I've always really had a good time with little tiny kids, younger kids who want to learn about plants, especially when it's involving like making paints or colors. Lemme says this also seems like a really good way to also incorporate traditional indigenous ecological knowledge into science and art. Absolutely. So why am I blanking on this? University of Michigan Biological Station, yeah, UMBS, does, so we also colloquially known as Bug Camp also, does an ethnobotany class that deals a lot with this. So we've got folks, indigenous folks from around the area who come in and teach the students how to make baskets, how to dye with lichens, so an ammonia,
Mm.
which is a really fun, really stinky process. But and then also things to eat in the wilderness. So there's a whole slew of ways to incorporate and respectfully incorporate and talk to indigenous people of an area. And that is something I would really like to incorporate into a lot of my work. Jim says, I'm wondering what you think about literature in its various forms, possibilities in tandem with science and illustrations, visual art in this endeavor. Actually, I just submitted it's been a year, a couple, they're not just, a couple illustrations to a compendium of poetry and pictures of plants from the local southeastern US area. It hasn't come out yet because they promised they would mail me a copy and I haven't gotten it in my mailbox. But it looks like a really, really cool experiment of how to show the way people feel about places they live, because people have very strong feelings about, especially places like the Appalachians and all the plant life there, which a ton of the plants and animals are endemic to the area, and people have a very long history there, both settler and indigenous people. And that seems like a very good way to get those feelings across, an illustration of an animal or plant paired with a poem written by somebody from the area who cares a lot about those plants and animals. Um, in other ways, what I think, science, illustration, visual art. A book I think everyone should read, two books actually, is Braiding Sweetgrass and Gathering Moss by Robin Wall Kimmerer, because the way she writes is art. And she's also a scientist. She incorporates all sorts of scientific concepts as well as traditional ecological knowledge of indigenous people into her books. And I think that is a very good jumping off point for how we maybe should be thinking about like cultural and identity and literature in tandem with outside environments, because we can't ignore the component of like traditional ecological knowledge and indigenous knowledge in this. Does that answer your question? Maybe.
I'm glad you mentioned that book. It was like when you started your talk and we're talking about like is science the opposite of art. I was immediately thinking about in Braiding Sweetgrass when she's talking about like why the goldenrod and the whatever
Yeah.
other flower that was.
Right.
Um,
With things like natural dye and like weaving fibers, which people have done for thousands of years and define most of material culture, you cannot separate science and art. Like that traditional knowledge is
yeah.
science. Is
Hmm.
a It's not Western science, but it is a way of knowing that is like the same validity. So that, yeah, that's very important.
Okay, and I'll give people just another moment to throw something in the chat or unmute, and then I have a final question before we end. But I'll just give people a few seconds. All right, so I like to end all of our talks with the same question for the speaker, which no pressure, but if there was one takeaway that you wanted people to come away with from your talk, like one main message for us to all go into our lives with, uh, what would it be?
Be curious. Interrogate that little part of you that when you see something wonders if it could be something more. Don't squish it, because that is the only way that I got into what I'm doing. I decided to follow that curiosity. And I know it can be a lot of trouble and a lot of work, but being curious can lead you to some really interesting places. Not necessarily science and art, but in anything that you do. Yeah.
Very cool. And then that will be our second to last question because Wesley did get one in the chat. So
Oh, Wesley says, have you ever talked to anyone in the culinary arts about your ancient plant meal idea? I think it would be an interesting crossover that teaches about biochemistries of foods or even recreating dishes that may have been plausible to a certain time period. I have not. I know there's an archaeobotany department at University of Florida, but I don't think we have an archaeobotanist. So I don't just want to rock up to the collections and be like, hello, please help me. But this would be something that I'd be so interested to actually recreate. I've just been incredibly busy lately, and that's kind of been on the back burner, but I think it would be a really fun idea for even, yeah, a chemistry class or like a physiology class, like figuring out how plants affect different body systems. Because like horsetails are medicinal, right? And ferns can be fairly toxic if they are eaten like when they're fairly grown. Like, what is it? What is the word? Oh, I leave Michigan and I forget all my foraging words. Fiddleheads. Fiddleheads can be all right. And then like pine nuts are edible, but sometimes they make your mouth taste like metal. So it'd be interesting to know the chemistry and the physiology of some of these like older, more ancient plant foods.
all right. Well, thank you again, Ashley, so much for being here and talking with us. Thank you to everyone who came today. This is our last lecture of the season, so keep an eye on the website for upcoming field trips and then for our lecture series in the fall. And I hope everyone has a great evening. Thank you.